It had been months since her life felt like anything but routine. She woke up at the same time every day, made breakfast, and exchanged the same polite conversations with her husband before he rushed off to work. Their love wasn't gone, but it felt buried under years of predictable patterns and the weight of unspoken exhaustion. She often wondered when the spark had dimmed, or if it had simply been smothered by time. That morning started like any other. She was in the kitchen, halfway through her coffee, when the doorbell rang. Surprised, she opened it to find her nephew standing there, suitcase in hand and an apologetic smile on his face. He was her husband's sister's son, younger by a decade but with a confidence that made him seem much older. "I hope I'm not imposing," he said, his voice warm and sincere. "I just need a place to stay for a few days. Is that okay?" She hesitated for a moment but quickly nodded, stepping aside to let him in. There was no reason to refuse, though his sudden arrival felt like a ripple in the still waters of her predictable life. Her husband wouldn't mind, they were family, after all. Over the next few hours, she noticed things about him she hadn't before. He had a way of filling the space with his presence, not loud or overbearing, but effortlessly charismatic. He spoke about his recent travels, his plans, and his struggles with a candidness that felt refreshing. It had been so long since she'd had a real conversation with someone. At dinner, her husband seemed distracted as usual, leaving the bulk of the conversation to her and her nephew. She found herself laughing at his stories, something she hadn't done in what felt like ages. His humor was sharp, his wit disarming. She realized, with a pang of guilt, that she was enjoying his company more than she should. That night, as she lay in bed, her thoughts kept drifting to him. It wasn't just his charm, it was the way he looked at her, directly, as though he saw something in her that had long been forgotten. She told herself it was nothing, just the novelty of having someone new in the house. Yet, deep down, she knew it was more than that. The next morning, he joined her in the kitchen while her husband was already off to work. "Thanks for letting me stay," he said, his tone genuine. "I didn't know where else to go." She waved off his gratitude, but her heart beat faster when his hand briefly touched hers as they reached for the coffee pot at the same time. It was such a small thing, but the jolt it sent through her was undeniable. For the first time in years, she felt seen. Not as a wife or a homemaker, but as a woman. And that realization was both thrilling and terrifying. The days that followed were unlike anything she had experienced in years. There was an unspoken ease in her conversations with him, a lightness that had been missing in her life for so long. He had a way of asking questions that made her feel interesting, alive. It was disarming, this sudden attention, and though she tried to dismiss it, she found herself drawn to him in ways she couldn't explain. They spent more time together than she intended, simple things at first. Preparing meals, tidying up the house, or watching television when her husband was working late. Each shared moment carried a subtle undercurrent, a feeling neither of them acknowledged but both felt. Once, as they cleaned the living room, their hands brushed against each other while picking up the same book. She looked up, startled, and found him looking at her, not with the casual politeness of family but with something deeper, something she wasn't sure how to name. She pulled her hand back quickly, her cheeks warming, but the image of his gaze stayed with her long after. At night, when the house was quiet, her mind became a battlefield. She thought of her husband, of the life they had built together. He wasn't cruel or unkind, he was steady, reliable. But that steadiness had turned into something else, something heavy and stagnant. The excitement she felt now, just from being near her nephew, was a reminder of what she had been missing. She hated herself for it. One evening, as they sat in the kitchen after dinner, he began to talk about his own struggles. He spoke of a recent heartbreak, a relationship that had ended before he was ready to let go. "It's strange," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "You think you know someone, and then they're gone. It makes you question everything. She listened intently, her chest tightening as he shared his pain. It felt intimate, this exchange, as though they were the only two people in the world. She wanted to comfort him, to tell him it would be okay, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she placed her hand on his, a small gesture meant to console, but that sent an undeniable spark through her. He didn't pull away. Instead, he looked at her, his eyes searching hers for something she couldn't define. For a moment, the air between them felt heavy, charged with unspoken emotions. She was the first to break the gaze, pulling her hand back as if burned. "I should get to bed," she said quickly, her voice unsteady. That night, she couldn't sleep. The guilt was there, gnawing at her, but so was the exhilaration. She replayed the moment in her mind over and over, wondering what might have happened if she hadn't stepped away. For the first time, she found herself anticipating the next day, not for the comfort of routine, but for the uncertainty it promised. The tension between them had grown almost unbearable. Every shared glance, every accidental touch, seemed to linger longer than it should. She tried to tell herself that it was all in her head, that she was reading too much into his actions. But deep down, she knew the truth. There was something between them, something neither of them had the courage to name. That evening, the house was unusually quiet. Her husband had called to say he'd be working late again, and the nephew had offered to help her with the dishes after dinner. They worked in silence for a while, the clinking of plates the only sound in the room. Then, out of nowhere, he spoke. "You seem unhappy," he said softly, not looking at her. The words caught her off guard, and for a moment, she didn't know how to respond. "I'm fine," she said quickly, too quickly. But her voice lacked conviction, and they both knew it. "You don't have to pretend with me," he said, finally meeting her gaze. His eyes were filled with a sincerity that made her chest ache. "I can see it. You deserve to be happy." The weight of his words hit her harder than she expected. She looked away, focusing on the sink as if it held the answers she needed. "It's not that simple," she murmured. "Maybe it is," he replied, stepping closer. She could feel the warmth of his presence, and it made her heart race. "Sometimes, you just have to be honest with yourself." The silence that followed was thick, charged with emotions neither of them could ignore. When she finally turned to face him, he was closer than she realized. Too close. Her breath caught as she looked up at him, her mind a whirlwind of guilt and desire. "I don't think we should," she began, but her words faltered as he reached out, his hand brushing against her cheek. The touch was gentle, almost hesitant, as if he was giving her the chance to pull away. But she didn't. "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't help how I feel." The room seemed to shrink around them, the world outside fading into nothing. She felt her resolve slipping.